Of these things that we'll be looking at under meteorological considerations are things that are different in the sky, in the atmosphere after the flood that would have not been this way prior to the flood. So it still all ties in with our study of the flood because we would have seen some of these changes. And as you can see, the first of those things is the hydrologic or the water cycle. That consists of three phases: evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. Now remember that since we had no precipitation prior to the flood, there would have been no water cycle, not the threefold water cycle as we know it to exist today of evaporation. That's the process of water going from the earth up, condensation, the process of the vapor turning into precipitable rain, that type of moisture, and then precipitation, the falling of that vapor that's now been converted into water back down to the earth. And the whole earth functions on this very basic, elementary cycle, threefold hydrologic cycle of the evaporation, the condensation, the precipitation. And this was something that was not even really believed until several centuries ago. But I want to show you several texts starting in Ecclesiastes 11 that the ancient writers of Scripture realized this, that it took place. You see, the sun today causes millions of tons of vapor to rise from out of the oceans, out of the seas, to a lesser extent, as we'll see from some of these texts, out of rivers and ponds and lakes and so forth, which is common knowledge to everyone today, causes it to rise up into the air. Then whenever the temperature falls below the point of saturation, then the moisture, which was vapor, turns into water, and soon the clouds will let down rain. Here in Ecclesiastes 11, Verse 3, you can see at least part of the cycle spelled out definitely here. Even your average tree transpires, I don't know how many thousands of gallons of water vapor every year. You see, the tree takes up in through its roots moisture out of the ground, and then it expires moisture, although we don't see it. It comes off as vapor. Something like 4,000 or 5,000 gallons of water come from every average-sized tree all over the whole planet. Another place that moisture is derived from. But here in chapter 11 and verse 3 of Ecclesiastes, if the clouds be full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. Now we don't need to read the rest of that, but here we've got a statement that looks to be so simple. You have to remember these texts because, see, I've got other things in mind that I know we'll get to that the critics say about the cosmology of the Hebrews in the Old Testament. But anyway, to start off with, if the clouds be full of rain, now that doesn't give us a threefold cycle, but it implies part of it. How did the water, the rain, get into the clouds? You see, if it was there, let's say to begin with, then with all the rain that you have over the course of months, years, centuries, millennia, and so forth, they would have emptied themselves out. How did they get replenished? With moisture again. If a cloud carries over 10 gallons of rain and it empties 10, then where does it get it when it comes over next time? The clouds be full of rain. They empty themselves. This is precipitation here. We've got, by implication, we've got the evaporation. How did the clouds get moisture in the first place? And then definitely we have condensation. It would have turned the moisture of vapor into rain that would have existed in the cloud. And then very definitely we have the third phase of the cycle. They empty themselves upon the earth. See, it wasn't until the 16th and 17th centuries that this was actually accepted to be the true scientific fact as we know it to be today. Amos chapter 9, verse 6, second part of that verse, He that calleth forth the waters of the sea, and poureth them out upon the face of the earth, the Lord is his name. Well, you see, the scripture writers knew how that moisture got up into those clouds. It says that he calls forth that water out of the seas. And this was not believed until just 2 or 3, 4 centuries ago. We had no idea. Modern man had no idea how water got in the clouds. Because we all would think back then that as soon as it rains there, it emptied itself. And then what's going to happen the next time we need rain in this area? God calls the waters in his providence, the way he set up the laws of nature. He calleth for the waters out of the sea. Now we've specifically got evaporation there. With Ecclesiastes 11:3, now you've got all 3 phases, but really you have it in both verses if you just look carefully enough. There's evaporation. He calls waters, but no one sits there and sees waters just jump out of the sea and go up. It goes in invisible vapor form. So there you've got the condensation, because if it's going to be poured out upon the face of the earth, which is the precipitation, you can't pour vapor out on the face of the earth. It would have to be turned into liquid as rain. So again, a passage where you've got all 3 together. Psalm 135 and verse 7. Jeremiah 10 and verse 13. Then in Ecclesiastes 1 and verse 7, what did the preacher say? All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. I mean, if it was, then why would the rivers keep emptying into them? You'd think, well, if they empty long enough, pretty soon the sea's going to overflow its banks. Now, you see, lakes will do that, but the ocean will never do that, though. That's the big difference. Lakes will overflow their bank. They can only go so far. But the ocean is so vast, it has so many tons of water taken out of it every day that it can receive in tons of water. All the rivers run into the sea. That's a general statement. Of course, we know all of them don't, but many of the large continental rivers, Mississippi River, Nile, and Amazon, and so forth, run into the sea or the ocean. Yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return again. Well, he's asking the question here, how did the rivers get their water in the first place? Well, they got it from the snow in the mountains, or just from the runoff of the land. Well, where did the land and the snow, the mountains, get their water from? They got it whenever it snowed or rained that came from the clouds. Well, where did the clouds get theirs from? They got it from the water that came out of the sea that came out of the river. And we're back to that cycle again. That's why it's called a water cycle. It's around and around and around. You never run out of water. It turns into vapor, but then it's going to rain sometime later. But the seas are never full. You see, in a lake or in a glass of water, it'll eventually get full, but not the seas, because they're putting out just as much as they're taking in, even though we have tremendous water courses that are emptying water into them all the time. Now, he's showing here in Ecclesiastes the endless cycle of life. And he's just using the hydrologic cycle as a comparison of that. But it must mean that they understood that, or how could they understand the comparison here? Unless they understood that from whence the rivers came, thither they return again. It doesn't mean they turn around and flow back uphill. They flow down from the mountain, now they turn around and go back uphill. He doesn't mean that. He's seeing something a lot deeper than modern man saw for hundreds and hundreds of years. That the water's going to empty into the sea, and it's going to evaporate, it's going to rain or snow again, and the river's going to become full all over again. Where the river came from last time, it comes from this time, and where it goes this time, it goes next time. And it's nothing but an endless cycle around and around. But it wasn't believed by modern man, modern educated man, until the 16th, 17th centuries. It had no idea what happened and why the oceans were never full. And what happened, mysteriously, when you put that cup of water outside the door and tomorrow it's gone. Very mysterious. And if you weren't taught that in 2nd or 3rd grade, then it'd be mysterious to you. Who stole that water? You could sit there and watch it, make sure no one stole it, lock it up, leave that cup of water sitting there. Next morning you get up, the water's gone. The cup's still there. You think someone would steal the cup and leave the water. But they took the water. No one saw anyone take it. No one even saw it go. It's like we said in some recent message, you can sit and watch the hour hand on the clock, and it'll never move. It'll never move. I tried it again just the other day. I was determined I was going to see it move. And you just sit there and don't blink an eye, and just fix your eye on that hand. And you won't see it move. I don't even think you can see the minute hand move. Only one you can see is that second hand move. That minute hand, it's moving fairly quickly in comparison to the hour hands. But still, you won't see it move. It moves imperceptibly. Well, the ancients couldn't understand what happened to the water. You'd leave it out there and it'd all be gone later on. And they couldn't figure out what happened to it. They didn't realize that God took that water just to give it back to them next week in another form. And you have to have this whole cycle going on, or we'd run out of water after a while. If the sun stole all of our water and never gave it back to us, we'd end up with no water on the planet. The sun steals water, but then the temperature, when it goes below the point of saturation, allows that vapor to turn into rain in the clouds, and the clouds, soon after that, after they have their condensation nuclei, then begin to pour forth those waters upon the earth. Okay, another consideration that we can bear in mind is groundwater. What happens to water whenever the rains descend upon the earth? Does it all turn into vapor and go back into the clouds? Isaiah chapter 55. No, some of it is kept as groundwater. Again, the ancients who were unlearned in Scripture, they thought that the earth was impenetrable. Oh, a few inches down, they knew that water could seep down there, but they thought that the earth was impenetrable. They knew that plants and trees and so forth had to have water to grow by, but they felt that must have been some type of water that was already way down there beneath the ground. They didn't realize that it was the very water that came from the skies that was, once it rained upon the earth, was many times after it had seeped down into the earth, locked up afterwards as groundwater. And then it provided the necessary water for the plants and for the trees to grow. Isaiah 55:10. You see, right in the midst of these spiritual teachings, he'll be using the analogy from nature that you have to understand. As the rain cometh down, and the snow from heaven, and returneth not thither. In other words, that means that some of it doesn't return. Now, we just saw from all of the other passages, many times it does return. But here, Isaiah 55:10, there's some rain and snow that never returns back as vapor, because it's utilized completely by the plant or by the tree, whose taproot has gone down deep enough to take it out. And he tells us, but it waters the earth and makes it to bring forth and to bud, that it may give seed to the sower and bread to the eater. And then he compares his word to that. So shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereto I sent it. Now, you can meditate on those two verses some other time and see all the implications of what he's saying by understanding what groundwater does. That it comes down, and although some of it returns, it means some of God's word returns. Some of it falls on deaf ears and doesn't accomplish anything in them, but hardening the heart that was already hardened to begin with, like old Pharaoh's heart and many denominational Christians' heart today. But there is some of that word that falls, some of that rain that falls, that never returns back, because it begins to give life to us so that we can produce fruit afterwards. Third aspect, the subject of water spouts and tornadoes. Now, these are similar to each other. They are different in a few areas. Psalm 42. This country has the unwanted distinction of being the country that is most plagued with tornadoes of every or any country on the face of the whole globe. Do you know that? We've got more tornadoes in this country than anywhere else in the world. That's what I was fixing to ask. I wonder why. Might be a purpose for that. When do tornadoes take place? Out of the 12 months of the year in this country. All of them. There's a tornado every month. Of course, the peak time is the month of May. And the valley time, so to speak, is the month of December. Which out of the 50 states do you think has had a tornado, including Maine, Rhode Island, even the non-continental states, Alaska and Hawaii? All of them. There's no state in the 50 states, United States, that has not experienced a tornado. Even Hawaii, Alaska, you'd think Alaska's never had a tornado. Well, it sure has. Now, they don't have the great ones that our Midwestern states do. Texas is the number one state. Of course, it's got more territory. You've got more room to have tornadoes. Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, and Florida, the 6 leading states that always have. But we have them right here. We've had them this year in this state. Terrific violent force, but you don't have many of those over in the Middle East. You have what they call whirlwinds. Remember, God's appeared in Scripture in more than one place in a whirlwind. But you don't have tornadoes, but you do have water spouts in many different places. Psalm 42:7 happens to mention that. It does appear to be speaking of a water spout per se because of the context of what's being said here. Specifically, the second half of Psalm 42 and verse 7. Now, as I say, a water spout and a tornado are similar, but there are two differences. A water spout, by definition and by name, has to happen over water. It's pretty much the same as a tornado, except a water spout happens over water, and a tornado always happens over land. And a tornado, 90% of the time, spins counterclockwise. Whereas a water spout, it's about 50-50. It can spin clockwise or counterclockwise. Now that's in this hemisphere. Tornadoes spin clockwise in the southern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere. They're powerful, violent. They are the most violent atmospheric disturbance as far as a rotating mass of air is concerned. The wind speeds of tornadoes, of the average tornado, is 300 miles an hour. And the highest recorded speeds for tornadoes, they're much more destructive than hurricanes, much more destructive. They're not as long-lasting. A hurricane is out there at sea for a long time before it comes to land. A tornado generally touches down in one place. It has a path that's maybe a couple of 100 feet or maybe 100 yards. And it'll only stay on the ground for maybe a mile, maybe only a block. And then what happens? It's gone again. The greatest one I remember that we had in this country was back in 1925, and it touched down, and it didn't lift back up for 219 miles. And it killed almost 800 people in one tornado. Really, it was 37 tornadoes. When one of them starts, it disturbs the air so much that generally you have brother and sister tornadoes, they're called, that start up somewhere in that vicinity. Didn't lift up for 219 miles. And generally, you know how they do. They just bounce up and down. They'll hit a place almost indiscriminately. They'll hit a building and skip over 2 Christians' homes and then hit another building again. And tornadoes, you see the average tornado, 300 miles an hour, the speed. They don't move very fast, just 30 to 40 miles an hour as far as the moval of the funnel cloud. But the wind speed has been known to drive pieces of straw right into a 2x4 board. They've even found chickens that have been stuffed in milk bottles. And you can't stuff a chicken in a milk bottle. But the speed and the angle was so perfect that it stuffed a chicken. This has happened more than once. And you know those old-fashioned milk bottles you used to get milk in? Stuff a big old rooster in one of those things without breaking the bottle. And you know, how did it do that? Well, how does it put a piece of straw, just like a spike, right in the 2x4? It's got so much power, velocity, speed, and it hits it at the right angle. And of course, it could drive a piece of straw into an individual's heart, just like hammering a spike into him. But the water spout here now of Psalm 42 is a different thing. It's similar. It's a cousin to the tornado. It's really a tornado over water that's not as powerful as a tornado over land, that comes from cumulonimbus clouds, the same thing as a tornado does. Very dangerous cloud. It's a cloud that produces thunderstorms and so forth. Anyway, Psalm 42 verse 7. Deep calleth unto deep. Well, you know what that word means. We've covered that enough. It somehow speaks of water. So you know he's talking about the depths of water. Deep calleth unto deep at the noise of thy waterspouts. Now we know that it's talking about waterspouts rather than waterfalls, first of all, because of the first part of verse 7. When the Bible in the Old Testament speaks with that word deep, then it refers to the seas and to the oceans, not to rivers, which would be the immediate producer of waterfalls. And secondly, because of the end of the verse, all thy waves and thy billows are gone over me. Well, you don't have those in rivers. You have those out in the oceans and out in the seas. So you have a waterspout here. Yet the Lord will command his loving kindness in the daytime, and in the night his song shall be with me, and my prayer unto the God of my life. So evidently the writer here has witnessed waterspouts. It's a huge funnel cloud that dips down from a cumulonimbus cloud over water. And it sucks water and seawater up into it. The most famous one that's ever taken place as far as records are concerned, most of them we never hear about because of the vastness of the ocean. Whoever spots all the waterspouts that take place out there. But there was one in the year 1896 off of the coast of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts that was so powerful. There were many thousands of people there gathered together for a certain reunion, and there were scientists in their midst that spotted this, that gave an estimate of its height and so forth. And it was so powerful that it sucked water and fish up out of the ocean, and several hours later, there in Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, it rained fish and salt water. Huge big fish came right out of the clouds because this had sucked it up a funnel thing all the way up into the cloud, carried it over land, and then let loose of all that stuff. And so when you hear people talking about raining cats and dogs, it's not as far out as you might really think. That would be amazing, to be somewhere where it rained big eels and squids on top of you, and tuna fish and stuff like that. And of course the water that's coming down, you'd have to see, that's back whenever you collected water off your roof. But everyone had to empty their barrels after that rain, because your barrels would have filled up with salt water. And you would have tasted it as it ran down your face and got in your eyes and began to burn. So it was very unusual. And that's been known to happen, just the force of it as the funnel cloud descends, just like a tornado. It comes out of the cumulonimbus clouds, and as soon as it touches that water, it throws things every direction. And in some instances, although it's relatively rare, it can actually take something up in its midst and take it on up high enough so that when it moves over land, then it rains. Another meteorological consideration are the clouds. Certain types are mentioned in Scripture, such as in Proverbs 25:14. We have a reference to what we call fair weather cumulus clouds. Now this is what the Old Testament, and as we'll see in a moment, a New Testament text, uses to describe certain types of people. The New Testament uses it to describe certain types of professing believers. Proverbs 25:14. Whoso boasteth himself of a false gift is like clouds and wind without rain. Then if you look over in the book of Jude, the 12th verse, now we do have reference to professing believers. And this is what we know today as fair weather cumulus clouds. They look like the real thing, but they produce nothing. You'll always know the tree by its fruit, Matthew 3 says. Jude says, these are spots in your feast of charity, when they feast with you, feeding themselves without fear. Fair weather cumulus clouds, that's what we'd call them. Clouds, they are without water. Those big, puffy white clouds that they don't have a drop of water in them. And they look like the real thing to a person who's untrained as far as the recognition of certain types and formations of clouds are concerned. And it's such a huge billowing thing. You'd think that's got to have at least the Indian Ocean in it. And it comes right over your top, and if anything, it makes it more dry around there than water or anything. And he's saying that's what some professing believers are like. They look like the real thing, but they have no fruits. They look like they are a Christian, but they don't have Jesus in them. They look like they have water, but just because you're a cloud doesn't mean you're a good cloud. You might be a fair weather cloud like fair weather Christians. That's the only time you see them is during fair weather. When times get rough, then you don't find fair weather clouds anymore. You find the clouds that are able to do the duty that they're supposed to be doing on the earth, produce some rain. But you don't find fair weather clouds whenever the fair weather goes away. How typical of most Christians. Clouds they are without water, carried about by winds, trees whose fruit withereth, without fruit, and so forth. Speaking of this group of Christians that Jude is warning those receiving his letter about. Then if you look over in Job chapter 37, first of all, there's several places here in Job. Job's book is filled with references to nature. But in Job 37 and verse 16, the ancients knew about the balance of clouds. Now the balance of clouds is caused by the two opposing forces of hot air and gravity. Hot air is what keeps the cloud up there. What makes it just float around up there? Why doesn't it just fall? It's air from the surface of the earth that keeps it floating up there. But why doesn't it just float on outer space? Gravity keeps it from going too far. And so there's a certain thing known as the balance of the clouds, whether it's 1,000 feet up or 6,000 or 10,000 feet up, depending, of course, on a lot of extenuating circumstances, such as how heavy the cloud is with the available moisture in it. Then they are kept in balance by hot air that keeps it from coming too low to the earth, and gravity, which keeps it from going too high. Dost thou know the balancings of the clouds, the wondrous works of him which is perfect in knowledge? So they knew something about the balancing of the clouds. Then in Job 36, we start with verse 26. He's got quite a few verses here that speak of the clouds. Behold, God is great, and we know him not, neither can the number of his years be searched out. For he maketh small the drops of water. Well, they have to be in the clouds. They pour down rain according to the vapor thereof. They understood that vapor went up, and then it turned into a precipitable moisture. So again, we've got another verse saying the same thing. Which the clouds do drop and distill upon man abundantly. They understood that. Verse 29, also can any understand the spreadings of the clouds? Now for this, we need to turn over to 38 and verse 37, along with 36:29. It's really a similar thing being referred to here. Who can understand the spreading of the clouds? You know what they do out there. There'll be a whole sky full of them, and they have an almost infinite variety of shape. You try to fix your eye on a certain one, and you look back 10 minutes later, and it's gone, because it's not really gone. It's changed its shape now. 38:37, who can number the clouds in wisdom? There are a constant number of thunderstorms taking place all over the globe every 24 hours, and that number's 4,000. And although we know that, it's absolutely impossible even with the satellites in outer space, to ever number the clouds. We know about the thunderstorms, and it seems to be always a constant number all over the globe of 4,000 taking place every 24 hours. But there's no one and no satellite that can number all those clouds, because as soon as it would number one and look over on the other side of the globe for another one, that first one would have split into two now. And you've got two clouds there. And so, of course, what God is saying here is no one can number the clouds except me. Amen. Because as soon as one of them splits into two, I'll already know that before it split, because I'm the one that caused it to split. So he's the only one. Job asks, who can know the number, the spreadings of the clouds? Another area is the wind systems. Among the many things that cause wind, there are two primary things: the sun's radiation and the earth's rotation. The winds on this planet travel from the equator to the poles, and then from the poles back to the equators. And in the northern hemisphere, they always veer to the right when they travel, and in the southern hemisphere, they always veer to the left. And they always do this. Winds always go from the equator to the poles, and then from the poles back to the equator. And in the northern hemisphere, they veer to the right, and in the southern hemisphere, they veer to the left. And in the northern hemisphere, they veer to the right, and in the southern hemisphere, they veer to the left. Back to Ecclesiastes 1. In other words, what that shows is the fact that the winds have certain paths on which they travel, just like the currents of the ocean. See, animals have their paths. Human beings have their paths they walk on. Migratory birds have very precise and definite paths that they will, over the course of hundreds of years, come back to the very place they were born. And no one told them they were born there. No one told them they were born in a certain steeple of a certain missionary's endeavor, a leftover pueblo in Nevada or Colorado. And they always find their way back there. They have a certain path they take to get back there, like the Arctic tern. She travels 10,000 miles in her endeavor to get back home. And fish do the same thing. They have a certain path. The very currents in the oceans have a path. The winds of the heavens have a path. Lord. Ecclesiastes 1 verse 6, the wind goeth toward the south and turneth about unto the north. See, they knew that the winds there would go first of all from the equator to the pole, South Pole or North Pole, depending on where you are, and then would turn around and come right back the same direction. Now, how many of you knew that? You thought it blew from northeast or northwest or north or south or some direction, but the universal global wind systems always go from north to south, south to the north, from the equator to the poles, and from the poles to the equator. The Bible knew this. The wind goes toward the south, it turns around unto the north, it whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again according to his paths. You know what a circuit is? It's a path. Now, who tells the wind to do that? Who tells him that? You get back on your path, you've reached your destination, turn around and go back now. The winds always do that. Jesus uses the wind over in John 3 in a very interesting way. Amen. In John chapter 3 and verse 8. The wind bloweth where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whence it cometh and whither it goeth. Now, he's not saying that we can't know the circuits of the great wind systems, because he already told us that in Ecclesiastes 1:6. But there are break-off winds from the main wind systems on the globe that might come northeast, southwest, or whatever. They're just part of the global wind system. But have you ever stopped to think about that? You're standing in a place and the wind's blowing. Let's say that it's blowing from the south and you're looking south. And that doesn't mean, and you're here in Minnesota, that doesn't mean that the wind is also blowing from the south down in Louisiana, although that's due south from you. How far do you think you'd have to walk to get to the place where the wind stops blowing. In other words, that's going to be the place where it starts blowing at you. Or if you turn around to the north, you know, you're sitting out there and the wind is blowing against you, how far would you have to walk until the wind stopped? Jesus said, the wind blows where it wills, you hear the sound thereof, you can't tell from whence it cometh or whither it goeth. That'd be an impossible thing to do. I mean, some days it's perfectly still, and all of a sudden a breeze starts coming up. Well, if you ran fast enough, run back to where it started. And where do you think it started? Or run fast enough and try to catch up with it. You see, what I'm saying is it doesn't just blow through every state in the same direction. It's got to have a beginning somewhere. Where is that beginning if you trace it back far enough? It's got to have an end somewhere. Otherwise, you just have a wind going from Louisiana right up through Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, Canada, then it go over the globe and come back around to Louisiana. It doesn't do that. It just blows right here in a certain area, and then in the next state, the wind instruments will say the wind's not blowing here. But yet we knew that from our position, it was blowing right in the direction of that state. Then what happened to it? Where did it go? That's what he's saying here. He's using that analogy. No one can tell where it went. You can drive along and try to catch up with it, and so all of a sudden it's gone. You can be sitting out somewhere and the wind comes, and then all of a sudden it just gets still all over again. Where did that wind go? It doesn't necessarily go into the person's yard that was right beside you in the direction that the wind was going, because you could chase it there and maybe it wouldn't be there. Very interesting.
Glory, hallelujah.
Another thing is lightning that the Bible speaks about. This again is one of those phenomenon that was not understood at all until recently. Now we know that lightning results from unlike charges that build up in cumulonimbus clouds, thunderstorms, positive, negative charges that build up. When you get the right buildup of these opposite positive, negative charges, you end up with lightning. There are two types of lightning, basically. Cold lightning and hot lightning. Cold lightning is a short stroke with a high current, and hot lightning is just the reverse of that. Hot lightning happens to be mentioned over in Psalm 78 and verse 48. Most famous lightning to strike anything, of course, it struck the Apollo 12 spacecraft in 1969 as it took off from Cape Canaveral, or from Cape Kennedy. Nothing happened, but that was known all over the world that lightning struck that. And you see, lightning can be very damaging. The heat of a bolt of lightning is 50,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That's how hot it is. But you see, lightning has been known to strike people and go right through them to the ground, never harm them. It's just because they happen to be in a certain place with the right clothing on that they served as a conductor of electricity. And therefore the lightning bolt didn't hurt them at all. It went right through them, went right into the ground. And of course some people it strikes, it does hurt. You might be wearing the wrong clothing, you might be standing in the wrong spot. It's even theorized that the psychological makeup of a person can influence whether or not one is hurt by lightning or not. With a lot of turmoil in the individual, that lightning bolt, for some reason, can attach itself to the, now this is theoretical, so don't quote me on this, to the buildup of unlike charges in the person, and therefore do them quite a bit of damage. So in other words, it'd pay to be a peaceful person if you're going to be around places where lightning strikes. So you don't have buildup of unlike charges. It'll just conduct right on through you into the ground and won't harm anyone. But Psalm 78:48, he giveth up their cattle, speaking of the judgments against Egypt, also to the hail and their flocks, to hot, well, really it's lightnings. We call them sometimes thunderbolts, but that's only because it is a bolt of lightning that comes before thunder that we hear afterwards. You've probably all been taught since childhood that lightning always precedes thunder, and if you see it lightning, you count to 10, then you'll hear it thunder by the time you reach 10. And that generally is true. But sometimes it's not. I forget what the calculations, the figure is, the formula, but you can actually tell exactly how far, how many feet away that lightning bolt was. Why do you think the lightning comes before the thunder? Light travels faster than sound, much faster than sound. They happen at just about the same time. What causes the thunder is the terrific heat, supersonic speed of heat that the lightning bolt causes the air, the friction in the air. It heats the air up around the lightning bolt at a supersonic speed. And it heats it up so quickly it causes it to pop. Because remember how hot lightning is. 50,000 degrees Fahrenheit is how hot it is. And it heats the air up around the lightning or the thunderbolt in a supersonic speed so fast that it causes the friction in the air to pop around it. But since light always travels faster than sound, much faster than sound, although they happen very close to each other, you're going to always see lightning before you, if you're in range, and if it's not blocked out by a lot of clouds, you'll always see the lightning before you'll see the thunder because it travels faster. But that 10-second count's not always true because it can be close enough to you, and the wind can be in a favorable direction so that you hear it very soon after you see lightning. But generally, for some reason, that 10 is just about it. You count to 10, and by the time you reach 10, you'll hear a thunderclap. Well, the point of this verse is to show they recognize that there must be different types of lightning with different types of currents, and that were prolonged or not prolonged. And here we've got the type of hot lightning, hot thunderbolts. And then over in Job, this is very interesting, in Job 38:25, did you know that lightning travels along again, here we're back to paths, a certain path that's only a couple of inches wide, very, very narrow, of about 4 inches wide. And yet it looks like it lights up the whole sky to you. That's how strong and powerful lightning is. But in Job 38:25, who hath divided a watercourse for the overflowing of waters, and a way or a path for the lightning of thunder. And we know that today, that it travels along a path of atoms that have unlike charges that have built up in a cumulonimbus cloud. And the Bible in Job says that God's made a way for the lightning of thunder. It travels across a very, very narrow path, but it's still very strong. And a final area under meteorological aspects is the subject of air pressure. Job 28. Galileo was the first modern man to recognize the fact that air must have some type of pressure when he saw that a suction pump, those of you maybe in engineering will realize this and remember this, that a suction pump can't take water higher than 32 feet. To get it higher than 32 feet, you have to have a hydraulic pump. A suction pump can't take water any higher than 32 feet because of the pressure of air. Now, Galileo realized that. He realized just from observation that suction pumps would only take water up 32 feet. And so he says, well, the air must have pressure, and that's what keeps the water down. Why does it go exactly up to 32 feet, not 35 feet? Well, Job 28 and verse 25. Here we have in one verse the fact that there is pressure in the air and pressure in the water. You know, the deeper you go in the water, the greater the pressure is. That's why it's difficult to do deep sea diving, especially if you're unaccustomed to that. He looks to the ends of the earth, seeth under the whole heaven, to make the weight for the winds, and he weigheth the waters by measure. Air pressure and water pressure, both found here in one verse. Okay, then we come secondly to geomorphic considerations. First of all, we'll look at the navel of the earth. Where is the center of the earth as far as the Bible is concerned? Sometimes it's translated midst of the earth, but what it means is the navel of the earth. Well, looking at Psalm 74:12, where's the center of the earth? The navel of the earth. Now, I don't mean center as far as down inside it, but on the surface of the globe. Where's the center? It ought to be easy to guess since God's concerned about his people, Israel. The center of the earth is the nation of Israel, is Palestine.
Glory. Thank you, Jesus.
Psalm 74:12. God is my king of old, working salvation in the midst, that's all right, but really the Hebrew says in the navel of the earth. And you know what the navel represents, the center of the outworkings of the human body. It's right there in the center of your body. So God's working salvation in the navel of the earth, and he wasn't talking about working in Rome back here. He's working in Israel among his people.
Thank you, Jesus.
Ezekiel 38:12 is another passage. I believe it's probably translated midst again. I'll have to look and see. Ezekiel 38:12. This is translated midst, and it gives you navel in the margin. Now this is talking about Gog, Magog, latter-day invasion of Israel, so we know he's talking about Israel here. So we know that Israel is the center of the earth because she's called the navel. To take a spoil, to take a prey, to turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten cattle and goods that dwell in the navel of the land, which is Israel. So that's one way we know that Israel is the center of the earth, because she's called the navel of the earth. A second reason, Psalm 65, verse 5 and verse 8, and that's because all other nations are considered to be the furthest bounds of the earth. And if you're speaking north, south, east, west, and you speak of all other nations as being furthest bounds, that means you're in the center of the earth. Now we come to the earth's understructure. You might want to get this diagram down. It's a diagram of several different people, but Schiaparelli in his book, The Astronomy of the Old Testament, is noted as one of the higher critics, Schiaparelli, who believes that the Old Testament cosmology was quite grotesque, quite unfounded, as far as reality is concerned and as far as what we know to exist today. Now, before we look at this, I'll set the scene by giving you a couple of passages that brought up such problems as this diagram. And that is that some theologians have accused Israel of the Old Testament, as believing that the earth rested upon pillars. 1 Samuel, I tell you what, we won't read these. We might not have time, but I'll give them to you. 1 Samuel 2:8. In all these passages, it talks about the earth resting upon pillars. You know, pillars that would hold up a building, the earth sitting upon these. The Bible does speak of this. 1 Samuel 2:8, Job 9:6, Job 26:11, Psalm 75, verse 3. Now, in all these cases, the literal Hebrew, although it's translated pillar, means column, which really is the same thing, but it means column. We can see in other places where it's used, but this is what the green areas here marked with a P on this side, just above this green line, and on that side represent. Those are the pillars. This is a reference back in Job, I think, 26. First of all, that hold up this area, which we'll discuss in a moment, that are attached to these pillars that hold up the earth. So you've got two sets of them, because Job speaks of pillars of the earth and pillars of the sky. And so this is the diagram that's been conjured up by fertile minds of higher critics. These two P's down here would represent pillars. These two P's would represent pillars. These are the pillars that the earth is sitting on top of. And these are the two pillars that the sky is sitting on top of, because the Bible says that both of them are held up by pillars. This is third heaven. This is the highest heaven. You'll recognize all this terminology that we've discussed before, and it's very interesting that someone was as ignorant as this. This is waters above the firmament. Remember, the scriptures speak of the waters above the firmament. So this is a huge celestial sea up here of waters. And you can look in your text there in Job, and it speaks of treasuries of certain things. And here we've got the S, treasuries of snow, H, treasuries of hail, W, treasuries of wind. There are huge containers up there that hold snow, that hold hail, and that hold the wind. Because the Bible talks about God's going to call forth snow out of the treasuries of snow. In other words, a big container, huge box up there. Here is the firmament. Now remember, that's the Greek translation. What's the Hebrew say? Expanse. You see, the Greek gives wrong connotation. Firmament, and that goes back to us, to the Latin. If it's a firmament, then it must be firm up there. And they're criticizing the Jews of having a cosmology that said that there was a firm structure up there in heaven. It was the firmament. And if they were just taking the time to look up the Hebrew, they'd see it didn't mean firm. It means expanse. Just a lot of nothing out there. The expanse, not something firm. What do you think these two things are? Floodgates of heaven. Those are the gates that open up and it floods. Now here, stars, sun, moon, trees. What do you think these two things are? Fountains of the great deep. There are two big fountains of the great deep. What do you think this is? That's the waters underneath the earth. And what are these two things? Well, these would be what we're talking about now, the pillars that the earth is sitting on top of. And here's Sheol. Whenever you die, you slip down through these gates right here, through the water, down to Sheol. Now this you'll find in a lot of Bible dictionaries and so forth, and you'll find it in Schiaparelli's book, or similar diagrams of this, that this is what and you remember all these things are found right in Old Testament. And so they have drawn a diagram saying this is what the Jews thought about the earth. Well, let me give you some other texts. Psalm 104, verse 1, verse 5. Jeremiah 31:37. Job 38, verses 4 to 7. It uses these words pillars in a figurative sense. Amen. And when it uses them, it's speaking, we can't take time to look up all these passages, but it is speaking of the mantle and of the core of the earth. You see, we're on the crust up here, and it's saying that the earth rests upon pillars which symbolically represent foundations. That's what he's getting across here. Not two literal columns, but what are columns? They're foundations that hold something else up. So he's saying, in other words, that the earth rests upon foundations. It doesn't mean there's something underneath it. It just means that there's something underneath the crust. As you go down, you reach the mantle. As you go down further, you reach the core of the earth. And sure enough, this is what the Bible says, and this is what we know to be true. Over in Galatians 2, I'll just mention that, by the way, Peter, James, and John are called pillars in the church. Well, do you think they are literal stone pillars? No. They're foundations of doctrine and truth in the early church. 1 Timothy 3:16, the church is called the pillar of the truth. Well, the church isn't a pillar. Revelation 3:12, overcomers are called pillars. But we're not literal stone pillars that hold anything up. We're foundations and so forth. If you look in Job 26 and verse 7, here's the biblical cosmology. Job 26, verse 7. He stretcheth out the north over the empty place, and he hangeth the earth upon nothing. They realized the earth was suspended in space. It didn't rest upon anything. The earth was suspended in space. He stretches out the north over the empty place, and he hangeth the earth on nothing. It just hung out there. And they recognized this. They didn't think of it as resting upon two literal pillars. But they did recognize that there was something different than the crust that was down inside the earth. That was the foundation that all of us are founded upon. That all of us are standing upon. We're standing upon the foundations of the earth. But not two literal pillars. We certainly couldn't have floodgates, because what the Hebrew word means there is a lattice. And you know what a lattice is? That means that you've got a network, not a solid window pane or something. And why did all the waters start coming out in Genesis 7:11? If that was a literal lattice work there, they could have come out any time because nothing was there to hold them back. The same is true with all of the rest of this. A lot of perverseness as far as the higher critics are concerned. They've got it circled up there because to our understanding and to our eye, it looks like everything is flat as far as you can see. But you know the sky is arced because it's way over here on your right on the horizon, and it arcs over you and it ends over here. So that must mean the earth is flat, but the sky above you, of course, then you've got Sheol down beneath you, and the sky above you is a big arc. It ends right over here on this horizon and over here on this horizon. And of course, none of these things are true. The Bible says, Job 26, verse 7, he hangeth the earth upon nothing.
Amen.
Hebrews 11:3 says he upholds all things by the word of his power, not by pillars that help him hold the earth up. How does he hold it there in space? He holds it by the word of his power. And it doesn't fall down. I think it's stuck up there, it's going to fall. No. He holds it there by the word of his power. And then one final thing that we need to cover is the shape of the earth. According to the Scriptures, is the earth round or square? If it's round, then what are we going to do with those references that speak of the four corners of the earth? Ezekiel 7:2, Isaiah 11:12, Revelation 7:1. If the earth is round, we know it to be round. We're talking about if it's round from the scriptural description of it, then what are we going to do with the four corners? Because if you've got four corners, you couldn't be round. You'd have to be flat. And you'd have to either be a square or a rectangle or something that's got four corners. You couldn't be a triangle. You'd only have three corners in. But you couldn't be round. Well, again, we have to go back to what the Hebrew word means there for corners, as well as over in the Greek. When it translates it four corners, the Hebrew means extremities. The four extremities. And it names it the four extremities because of the four obvious, well-known directions: north, south, east, west. It doesn't mean that you're on a flat plane and you're living in a square that has four corners. But it speaks of the four extremities because of the well-known four-directional aspect of the earth: north, south, east, west. Doesn't matter where you are on the globe, except two places, North and South Pole, there's going to be a north, south, and an east and a west. So when it says four corners, doesn't mean that we're living on a square or on a flat plane. We're living on a sphere, but we've got four generally accepted directions of north, south, east, west that are the extremities of the earth. Now, if you look in Isaiah 40 and verse 22, I want to show you a very interesting verse. I remember in college, I was trying to go to bed one night. For some reason, I've never forgotten it. And my roommates cornered me on that one. Said if the Bible is really infallible and it's always true, and everything in it is correct, which of course I was always telling them was so, then the Bible is wrong on its description of the shape of the earth because it says it's got four corners. So it'll be helpful to realize that it simply means the four extremities of north, south, east, and west. But better than that, you can remember Isaiah 40 and verse 22. It is he that sitteth upon the circle of the earth.
Hallelujah.
That word simply means sphere in the Hebrew. So the Bible recognizes the fact that the earth is not flat with four corners, that the earth is a spherical ball. Not a perfect sphere. It lacks a couple of degrees being a perfect sphere, but it's very close to being a perfect sphere. And a text you might have never have thought of that teaches the same thing that we'll close with is over in Luke 17 that you'll probably find to be very interesting. The Bible teaches that the earth is a sphere and not a flat plane. Luke 17, notice this. Notice very carefully. You've probably never seen it before. Verse 34. Speaking of the last days here. I tell you, in that night there shall be two men in the bed, the one shall be taken, the other shall be left. You're in bed at night, and he says it's night. Two women shall be grinding together. The Jewish women always grind their meal or grind their grain into flour to make their bread in the morning. It's always when you grind that. One shall be taken, the other left. Two men shall be in the field, the one shall be taken, the other left. Men always work in the field during the daytime. In other words, how can the coming of the Lord take place at night and in the daytime at the same time? Unless we're living on a sphere, which means that one half of it's in darkness and one half of it's in light. That's a proof text, if anyone wants a proof text. How can his coming be at night and be in the morning and be in the afternoon? Well, it could be night in this country, morning in Japan, and night in Russia. Or afternoon in Russia. It just depends on where you are, whether it'll be night or in the morning or in the middle of the afternoon. But you can't have that on a square, though, because it's going to receive all of the sun's light at the same time. If you're living on a flat, square plane, there couldn't be night at one end of it and daylight at the other end of it. It'd either all be dark or all be light. But if you're on a sphere, then half of it can be darkness, half of it can be light, which means the Bible doesn't speak of the earth as being a flat plane.
Amen.
So you can remember Isaiah's text and Luke's text there that God's the one who sits on the sphere or the circle of the earth. No, the Hebrews weren't wrong in their cosmology, and you see that all this has figurative meanings here. The fountains of the great deep. He's not talking about two fountains that opened up here and the pillars of the sky and the pillars of the earth. That's just figurative representations. It looks like the sky rests upon horizons in both directions. If you've got mountains over here, it looks like to you that the sky is actually resting on top of that mountain. But we know if you climbed over it, the sky would also be on the other side. And if you got up at the top of it, the sky would still be above you. You wouldn't be above the sky. So all this is figurative representations of various things that he's getting across.
For a complete list of Brother Ross's tapes and books,